Hola, ahora tendremos la siguiente conferencia. Ya tendremos aquí a Reka Similosi y también a Guillermo Castillo de INEGI moderando. Guillermo, te dejo la palabra.
Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this previous talk. For this next talk, we will be talking about the use of crowdsourced data for measuring fear of crime. For this talk, we'll have Reka Solymosi. She is a lecturer in quantitative methods at the Department of Criminology at the University of Manchester. She is a member of the Software Sustainability Institute and an honorary lecturer at University College London. And her research focuses on making use of new forms of data to gain insight into people's behavior and subjective experiences, particularly focusing on crime, victimization, transport, and spatial research. She's also dedicated to promoting data literacy in social science study and practice. And let me tell you a little bit more about this talk that we'll be having. In contrast to what we saw in the previous talk, fear of crime is not something that is normally recorded by the institutions. Fear of crime is traditionally measured by victimization surveys or by other means or other methods that are not typically recorded by the police or justice institutions. So in this sense, innovative techniques such as these are really helpful to innovate in the field. So without further ado, please, Reka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I, like Juanjo, I'm very sad that this is not in person, and instead it is a virtual conversation, but hopefully we can still have some good exchange of ideas and so on. The first thing I'm going to do, I'll just put in the chat my slides so people don't have to take notes or anything like that. You can access these. They will be online forever, well, until my licenses expire and so on. So that will be the slides I'll be using today, but I'll share my screen and we can go from there. All right. Ignore my messy desktop and hopefully you see my slides. Yes. Okay, super. Thank you very much. All right, so I will be talking to you for, let me start a timer for a good 25 minutes about new forms of data for public safety. So I took a little bit of a broader interpretation. I will talk about fear of crime as well, because that is my main area. But just generally how I've been using new forms of data in my research. And specifically, I'm focusing on crowdsourcing. So what is crowdsourcing? Well, the term was coined around 2005-06 by Jeff Howe in this article in Wired magazine, where he talked about the rise of crowdsourcing, and later in the subsequent book about crowdsourcing. But essentially, this definition can, from the book and the article and so on, is around harnessing information and skills from a large crowds into one collaborative project. So the idea is that you get lots and lots of people participating in something, and although the individual contribution might be quite small, it comes together into a collective project. And so one very good example that most people are familiar with is Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is this online encyclopedia where lots and lots of people contribute to it to have this shared repository of knowledge. And normally when I do a talk like this live, I would ask people to raise your hand if you have ever used or read Wikipedia. And I imagine everybody raising their hands at home. And then I ask, okay, raise your hand if you have contributed to Wikipedia. And then you get usually much fewer hands. Occasionally there's one or two, but maybe in this kind of audience, there might be more, but not many people. So keep that in mind for the future. So crowdsourcing, and this is only increasing since sort of the 2005-06 era, because we are constantly contributing data. I don't know how it is currently in Mexico. In the UK, we're in full lockdown. There's no pubs, no restaurants, nothing open except for shops. luckily, I live very close to the best brewery in Manchester. If you're ever here, you should definitely go. So if I want to go there and I pull up the directions on my phone, you can see I have all this information from Google Maps about where it is, 7 minutes walk, some ratings from people, and it even gives me a little prompt on the bottom. Do you know this place? Help answer some questions. And so I did, because why not? And then I get 3 points, right? I don't know what the 3 points do or why I got them or what I can use them for, but I've got them. So there's this constant reinforcement of contribute data, provide some information, no matter what it is that you're doing, even if it is just going out to get a beer. And this is interesting because we can start to use it to generate insight. So I'm going to illustrate this with a fun example before going into the more public safety side of things. I don't know if anybody has used Goodreads. Goodreads is a website, an app, and so on, where you can log the books you're reading, rate them, and tell people if you like the book or not, and write your little review. We also have these sorts of things for movies and TV shows, right? There's IMDb, there's Rotten Tomatoes. I'm spending a lot of time at home watching Netflix. So before I choose something, I will look on these to see, is this something that people recommend or not? Now, why is this important? Well, we can start answering, the important questions of life. For example, back when we were allowed to go to movie theaters, I don't know if you ever came out of the movie theater and heard somebody say, oh, the book was so much better than the film. Well, now with these kinds of data, we can start to answer these questions. And that's exactly what this team behind this 538 article did. They took the ratings of the book from Goodreads, and then they took the ratings of the film that the book got made into from, I think this was Metacritic, similar to IMDb. And they plotted the scores on this nice chart. And now we can actually see where was the book better, where was the film better. And in cases like The Godfather, both are perfect and you can't say a bad thing about them. So what does this actually mean for us in terms of researching public safety? How is this relevant for these topics? And I'm going to go through 3 key approaches that I have used in my research and how I've made use of these, I guess, new forms of data. So the first one is using found data. So this is data that people are contributing to a project that initially has nothing to do with the research question or anything like that, but is data that is already out there. The second is collecting data, but using this kind of crowdsourcing as part of the research design, as an element of the method of data collection. And the third is what I call metadata. It's not metadata in the sort of traditional sense, but it's sort of looking at the production of these data and how organizations and individuals use things like social media, this sort of thing, and what we can learn from that about how to improve these practices. So these are the 3 key approaches, and I will go through each one with some examples. So the first one I will focus on is to do with looking at found data. And I'll show 2 examples. The first one is this website called safecity.in. So this website was created by an organization, a charity in India, to allow victims of sexual harassment and victimization to report their experiences anonymously to this crowdsourced website. So if you visit the website, you will be presented with this platform, lots of information about the charity, the NGO that run this, but also an option for you to report any experience you might have. And this is nice. Earlier in the previous talk, there was a lot of discussion about the absence of accurate crime statistics from the police, from administrative sources, because people will not report things. And this is very much the case with things like sexual harassment, where there's lots and lots of barriers to reporting to police. So when we try and look for official sources of data, we don't really get a full comprehensive picture of when and where people are experiencing these kinds of victimization. So that is why the creators of this website created this, and they also wanted this information sharing, so they present the data they collect back. And luckily for me, this was presented in a way that allowed me to carry out some web scraping and acquire the data for some research purposes. And after such an approach, I noticed first that it was a global report. So even though it's very heavily focused in India, there was reports from around the world, but definitely concentrated India. Within that, concentrated in Delhi currently. And I could then use that data to start looking at identifying risky situations. So what are some correlates of victimization, breaking it down by different types of victimization. So in this case, you could see we looked for non-physical sexual harassment, only physical, and instances of both where they were combined, and how that might vary between the different locations. So one thing that stands out here, you can see for parking lots, these tend to be physical victimization places, whereas things like a bus stop or in the rickshaw or these kind of walking, so like transport, you get a lot of non-physical harassment, so catcalling, that sort of thing. So this is already giving us some interesting insight from this crowdsourced data. Another data set that I worked with extensively, this one is based in the UK, it's called Fix My Street. And this is a platform that allows people to report problems in their environment that they want the local authority, the local council to fix. So in this case, somebody reported some graffiti, they choose the location of the graffiti, they talk a little bit about it, they leave some extra information. We've got the time of reporting, for example, and a picture and these sorts of things. And so we have this information as well. And again, it was in a way where I could use some web scraping to collect these reports. And I got, I think, over 50,000 reports in the London Borough of Camden. So that's one of the local authorities that you saw on the map in the previous presentation. And from that, I mean, most of them were this, right? The biggest thing that people are complaining about is these kinds of problems of the pavements and of potholes and puddles. It rains a lot here, so that sort of thing. But about a third of them were to do with graffiti, with litter, with noise, and dog fouling, which is apparently a big concern of neighborhoods across the UK. And so I could use that to understand how people were experiencing their environment and when they were coming across something that might have made them feel worried. So this is something that they're experiencing as a problem. And we could use that to identify where people were having these experiences, right? And this is different than if we sent out somebody to go and carry out an audit and note every piece of graffiti that they come across, because it might be that some graffiti people don't mind, they think that's nice, or some graffiti it's hidden, people don't see it. But these are places where somebody has encountered it and thought it was a problem and therefore reported it. Not only that, but we get this dynamic picture as well. So as we have the additional information of when, for example, this thing was experienced, we can now start to break down the picture based on how these experiences move in places with the time of day, for example. So here you have the different sort of travel zones in London, so early AM peak, interpeak, and so on. And you can see it move from more residential areas to more sort of central commercial areas. All right, so the second type, I said these two examples were examples of found data. The second type is collected data. So we make a lot of assumptions, and I'll come to the limitations in a little bit. With the found data, we don't have a lot of control because we're not involved in the research design, question development, not involved with any of that. So sometimes we want to collect our own data, and we can still use these approaches to research design and incorporate them into our study. So what I did in this particular case, so here I was looking at the fear of crime. And I used an experience sampling method, which is where you take an approach where you ask people to almost create a diary. So every time they have a specific experience, to give you answer a set of questions and give you information about it. And you can have this in a way where they have to answer this questionnaire 4 times a day, or you can have it in a way where anytime X happens, please fill out this questionnaire, that sort of thing. And what I did is I took this research design approach and put it into a mobile application. And this enabled me to be able to communicate, to have the pings and the questionnaire in one place, but also to get a lot of additional information from the sensors in the phone. So we can get things like GPS, timestamp, You could get things like light levels and noise levels. I didn't, but these are all additional data that could be collected to tag onto this. So what I did, I asked people to report whenever I pinged them or whenever something happened, how worried they felt. I took the wording from our official crime survey, the Crime Survey England and Wales, and I just changed it to, in this moment, how safe do you feel? And if people answered either fairly worried or very worried, then they had some follow-up questions. So in that specific case, I also asked, what is it that you are specifically worried about? Is it being robbed? Is it being subjected to physical attack? Is it teenagers hanging around? That sort of thing. So we asked not too many questions because it needed to be quick in the moment kind of experience sampling collection, but enough questions to get some idea and context of people's experiences. And this is the application that I built. We had I think they were a Dutch film crew come and do a little documentary. So I have these nice vignettes. So that's the application. And it allowed me to create this map where basically following my participants around, anytime they felt worried, I get a little ping, ping, ping of this worry. And now we can map plot that so we can get this spatial data on people's experiences. So we can see where people are going, where they feel safe, and occasionally places where they feel unsafe. So you can see, for example, there in Regent's Park, we've got some points of worry. And again, like we got the additional element of the dynamic data collection with the Fix My Street data sets, we get this also with this continual report. So we can start breaking down worry by things like time, right? So we can see how the profile of an area changes with the time of day and so on. And I do want to note with this collection of, so again, asking people to self-report fear of crime, it has this additional advantage that for filling in the gaps of official data, that people are very willing to report where they're worried because, again, there's no barrier there. So one of the applications of this app that I carried out was to document fear about hate crime, because hate crime is very much underreported to police. There's lots of barriers to reporting, and people might feel a reluctance to report this thing. But when you ask people to report where they feel that they might be victimized, where they feel unsafe, actually people, there's no sort of evidence that needs to be collected. This is their experience. And so people are very quick to report that kind of experience. And we can match that up with the situational environmental characteristics of the location of these experiences. So the third type that I wanted to mention was looking at the type of data that are released in this way and what their impact is. So specifically in this case study, I looked at police use of social media data. And specifically I looked at Greater Manchester Police, and we looked at their Twitter page because we wanted to look at how they make appeals for missing persons to the public and what are the features associated with those appeals that might, I hope that was a response to how great this is. So anyway, yeah, Greater Manchester Police looking at their missing people reports. So what do I mean by that? Let's say somebody goes missing. Bart Simpson in this case has gone, he hasn't returned home. Parents report him missing to the police. The police will put out an appeal for information. So they will say something like this: have you seen Bart Simpson, missing since, date, works here, demographic characteristics, blah, blah, blah. Then they might use certain phrases. So please contact GMP. They might say thank you. In other tweets, they might say we are searching for, these sorts of things. But there's not a uniform template is what we found, but there are these elements that they use. Also, sometimes pictures are included, different kinds of pictures are included, and so on. And as an output, we wanted to look at engagement with these tweets, because if they're making this appeal, the assumption is they want the appeal to go far and wide. They want people to, as many people as possible to see it. So they might reach either the missing person themselves or somebody who has some sort of information associated with the missing person. So we looked at the engagement as an outcome, and we carried out a lot of feature extraction from the tweets to see what is associated, it's kind of exploratory search, what is associated with an increased engagement. For example, with the photos, we looked at photo quality, whether that made a difference. We looked at often the most recent picture that they will have of somebody is a custody photo. And so our hypothesis was that if you have a nice smiling photo with someone in the park with a dog, it will get shared more than a custody photo would, for example, these sorts of things. So that's what we looked at. And I have here just two quick shots of the results. So in here, we looked at photo quality going from sort of bad, average to good, excellent, and broken down by gender and by the ethnic appearance of the missing person. And we found that for women, didn't really make a difference, not hugely for men either, although you do see there's a bit of an increase. But what we did see is there's a growing difference between the number of retweets between the white and non-white ethnic appearance with the increased quality of the photo. So that was not something we were expecting. And here are just some examples of the kinds of phrasing that I mentioned earlier that we looked at. So there's the "have you seen Bart Simpson," blah, blah, blah. Urgent appeal, we are appealing for somebody is high risk and asking the public to please retweet. These had the tweets which included these templates had more retweets, whereas this kind of hashtag missing or asking people, can you help, or original phasing that didn't have any of these, they had less median retweets than those that did not. So I said in this, so far, I've been saying how amazing all of these data are, right? It's there, your found data, you just take it and it's free and you can learn all about people's experiences, and same with the experience sampling, you get spatially and temporally explicit data, and that's fantastic. And then with the tweets as well, you can just call the Twitter API and get thousands and thousands of tweets and start feature extraction and looking at associations between variables. But of course, there's always limitations with these things. And in this case, because it's still, the title is new forms of data, so it's still an emerging area, these limitations are very important, not just as something of, ooh, we have to keep in mind our conclusions are affected by this, but actually as directions for future research, because these data are increasing in volume, they are very useful, so we want to be able to use them. And by tackling these limitations, we are increasing the reliability and generalizability and validity of studies relying on these kinds of data. So for this limitations as well, I will focus on three key issues. I will talk a little bit about bias, which is probably something that hopefully has been ringing alarm bells in people's minds already. Then I'll talk about some of the assumptions that we make, especially in the case of the found data and what we should think about there. And of course, ethics. So I will sort of skim over some ethical issues, but that would be a whole talk in itself, the ethics of using these sorts of data. So in terms of bias, there is an obvious self-selection in our sample, right? So it is known that who participates in these kinds of studies is a specific demographic, right? So they tend to be white, they tend to be male, they tend to be older, they tend to be better educated, and they tend to live in more affluent areas. So taking these data is not going to be representative of our entire population. And a lot of the statistical methods that we would use are usually relying on the assumption that we've had this random sample, right? So for example, working with surveys, you have your random sample, it's representative. And so is it even appropriate to be using these types of analyses on these new forms of data? Besides the self-selection, so even though we might have this sort of biased sample, even within that, the participation is not equal. So even within our sample of people who have contributed, there will be an inequality how much each person contributes. So for example, if you remember back now to the Wikipedia example, this when I asked who has used Wikipedia, I assume everybody raised their hands internally at home. And when I asked who contributed, maybe a couple people, but hopefully not so much, raised their hand. Well, there's this kind of 99-to-1 rule of the internet, which I think Wikipedia exemplifies really well. So 99.8% of people who use Wikipedia are just lurkers. We're just there to read the articles. Those are, my students when I'm teaching, that sort of thing. 0.2% are occasional contributors. So, I contribute to the occasional article here and there, and yeah, I'm probably that 0.2%. But actually, the bulk of Wikipedia, so most of that content, is generated by 0.0003% of contributors. So that is tiny, tiny fraction of people who make the most contributions. And this is also the case in Fix My Street data and all sort of crowdsourced data. So here I used the Lorenz curve to plot the inequality of participation of named users. So Fix My Street, you can leave your name or you can report anonymously. But people who left their name, you can see this line here, it's a straight line. So up to about what I think is 75% of people only came once, only left one comment, one issue. They saw graffiti, it made them really upset. And so they reported that graffiti. That's it, never again. And then you've got this kink here, and then you've got 2. So another 10% of people, they only reported 2. And it really spikes up at the end here. So you can see this kind of top 1% of Fix My Street contributors. They are reporting a lot of problems in their neighborhoods. So this is important to keep in mind. About the assumptions, this is most relevant for found data where you don't have a say in developing the questions, the study design, nothing like that. So you don't pilot test the questions, for example. And so we make quite a few assumptions, which we have to be explicit about. One is the time of report really the time of experience? So in the case of Fix My Street, that is a question. In the case of Safe City, I think they are asked to report the time of the experience. But again, is that reliable? These sorts of assumptions we make. Inferred variables, so you might not have all the variables you want. Again, with Fix My Street data, I did not have any demographics, but I had people's names. So I could use first name to infer gender and surname to infer ethnicity with error margins in there. So even though I can use these workarounds, I am making lots of inferences and assumptions about these. And finally, you assume a shared understanding of what is being reported. And again, with Fix My Street, I like demonstrating this example. So here I plotted different kinds of incivilities and where they were being reported. So in terms of, for example, dog fouling, I mentioned earlier, no problem. These are reported in sort of residential areas. Things like litter, this is sort of King's Cross and Pancras, busy train station, lots of litter being reported. But then abandoned vehicle I see being reported in Covent Garden. And this is Covent Garden for people who haven't yet been to London. It's pedestrianized, it's shopping, it's very walkable, lots of things going on. An abandoned vehicle looks like this. So I was very confused about what's going on with the abandoned vehicle hotspot, but digging into the data revealed that people were reporting this as abandoned vehicle. And technically they're not wrong. I mean, it is a vehicle and it's been abandoned, but we would call this fly parking in the UK and not abandoned vehicle. So this is another assumption that we're making. And also ethics. So I said that this would be a whole talk in itself, but ethics, I just wanted to raise as something to think about. There's questions around data ownership. So in both cases where I scraped the data, I got permission from the website owners. But are they the owners of the data? Do I need to go further with permission seeking? I could have done it without permission as well. Did I need to seek permission? There's lots of questions around that. Data linkage. So with Fix My Street, if you have people's names, you can then start linking other data where people might have left their names that is maybe separately anonymous, but when you bring them together, you could maybe find out a little bit too much about each person. And this brings us to issues with privacy, with surveillance, with, if you're tracking people over time. And an important one is the implications of findings. So if you are using, for example, Fix My Street data to get information about where is the graffiti, And then based on that information, you are going to send out the cleaning up crew and they're going to clean up the graffiti. We saw that there's a huge bias in who is reporting. And even in that biased set, there's a bias of who is reporting more. And so if we start using these data to inform services, this might have implications for who is prioritized when we are delivering these services and who is not represented in these data. So in sum, there are lots of benefits of new forms of data. We can get insight into experiences and behaviors. We get additional spatial and temporal elements of our data that lets us break it down further what is going on. And we can get a lot of data at relatively low cost compared to more traditional measures. But there are key issues to keep in mind and to focus on. And I really want to emphasize these are great areas of future research in terms of representativeness and generalizability, in terms of the assumptions that we make, and in terms of the ethical issues surrounding these data. So I think I was just a little bit over time. So thank you for bearing with me. You've got the link to these slides. If you have any questions, you can contact me by email or Twitter. And also I think we will have Q&A now. And I've also included some further reading for people who are interested.
Thank you very much, Reka. I think it's been a really interesting talk. While we get the questions, you can post them in the chat box. I'm gonna ask you a few initial questions, if that's okay. You talked about the limitations of this new form of gaining the data. And in your research, you talk about different ways to address this kind of bias. Mainly, I'm going to refer to participation inequality. You talk about, for instance, that a small group of participants are responsible for the majority of the incidents that are being reported. And one way to address this is either by experience sampling method or ecological momentary assessment. Or you also mentioned combining crowdsourcing and machine learning to reproduce patterns captured by human participation at unreported or underreported geographical areas. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about those methods? That's one question.
Sure. Yeah. Why not? So let me stop my timer. I think, so this is a whole really exciting area, I think, of research, because when I started with this, I was really focusing on the data collection, right? How can we find out about how people feel, where they go, how that changes with different places and so on. So I was really focusing, okay, can we collect these data? Can we collect these data? And then I got to the end and then found that, okay, we can, but this person's gonna tell me a lot more than this person, and the representation is completely different. So now what can we do? And my training is very much with your standard frequentist statistics, which has all those assumptions. So I found, okay, well, how am I gonna go about analyzing this now? So in terms of those recommendations for future work, I think there's a lot there. I mean, with the experience sampling, the nice thing is that you have a little bit more control. So you are carrying out the research design. So you can say, I'm going to recruit, you can create your own sample, you can recruit from your sampling frame, you can make sure that everyone's represented, you can develop your weights based on your sampling frame, and so on. So that's one approach where you get a say in the research design. But of course, a lot of times we don't. So for example, with the Fix My Street data, the found data, it's already there and you already have the unequal participation in there. So you can do things like weight people, so nest the reports within each individual person who is reporting. So you can sort of play around with statistical measures to account for that. And that works to a certain extent, especially if you have the name of the people. But in the case of Fix My Street, for example, only about 1/3 of people actually left their name. So 2/3 of the reports were reported as anonymous. So it might be that there is somebody who is a frequent flyer, but they're just not identifying their name. And so in that case, we can't nest the reports within sort of each individual person. So again, that's something where we have to think about. And then, so in the previous presentation, I don't know if David is still here, but we've been working on, well, David mostly, on a way of using small area estimation as a way to try and unbias your crowdsourced data. So I don't know if I want to put David on the spot, but he can maybe tell you a little bit about that later on. I can't remember what else there was now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you basically responded to the question. I don't know if David wants to pick on the conversation. If not, I'm moving to a next question. Okay, I'll move on. Also, you mentioned that most crowdsourcing platforms do not include screening questions about variables. So in these scenarios where you could have control about the type of design, of research design that you would like to do, which will be these key screening questions that you would include in a platform such as this, besides obviously gender? And that leads me to my second question, which is, or third, better said. You also found that there are relevant differences between genders in terms of the types of incidents that they report. For instance, when it comes to violence against women, which is a very hot debate and topic right now in Mexico, and I believe most worldwide, what would be some key features or elements that motivate women to report their sexual harassment experiences in this kind of platforms?
Right. Okay. So there's quite a lot there. Going back to the first part about the screening questions, that really depends on the research question that you want to answer, I think. So what is relevant to that specific study? And for example, with the Fix My Street, something like age, gender, the demographics, they are things that have previously been associated with how people interpret signs of disorder, and whether encountering something like a scary graffiti would result in fear of crime or that sort of thing. So in that case, like I mentioned, what I did is I took the first name and tried to infer gender from that. And so there are tools for doing this, and there are ways of measuring the reliability, and generally they're good, but there's populations that will exclude. For example, people who are transsexual, they will be excluded from this kind of method if name is misgender, it might misgender people. And then there are names that can be either or, like in the UK, the name Sam, it could be male or female, probably equal parts. That sort of thing. But luckily the organization, My Society, they picked up on my research and they wanted to reproduce this. So they did a questionnaire where if you reported something on Fix My Street, it came up, can you please answer this questionnaire? And that asked the demographics. So sort of after the fact, it asked for these, what I call the screening questions. And it turns out that their numbers were very, very similar to my numbers from kind of inferring that. So that's for screening questions. I mean, in my research, things that I would ask around fear of crime would be things like previous victimization, right? That's something that is frequently associated with how safe people feel. And so that might be something that would be really useful to know. But in this case, there's no way of inferring it from this sort of data, but it will depend completely on the research question that is being asked. And then the other one was about reporting. So I worked so in the UK also, there's not a lot of reporting of sexual harassment, especially the things that are sometimes referred to as low-level sexual harassment. And I used to work with Transport for London, and there they had this initiative, Project Guardian, where the whole idea was about trying to get people to report, because we don't have the data, then we can't really look at where the hotspots are, where the problems are. And so I was working on this campaign called Report It to Stop It. And this was this big partnership rollout where they had this text number, so it's 61016. You can send a text message and report something, and then there will be a follow-up. It will be handed over. It will be taken seriously, this sort of thing. And the main thing that seems to be associated with people wanting to report is just how easy it is to report. So the easier it is for somebody to share their experience, the more likely they will. I mean, this sounds, well, obviously, but yeah, it's just the easier it is to share your data, and then also whether they think anything's going to happen as a result. So if they report and then they think nobody's going to care, nothing will be done, there's no consequence, then why would I bother? Because often reporting, and the more serious this is, the more traumatic it might be to report something. It might be a reliving of an experience. It might be associated with these sorts of things. And so reporting is not easy. And the easier that it is made and the more worthwhile it is made seems to be the things associated with it. So things like the Safe City initiative, for example, is this huge campaign to get women's voices heard, to get the voices of the victims heard, and to get the police to do something about these kinds of crimes. And when they perceive, oh, I'm contributing to this, something will change, that seems to be when more reporting is happening.
Thank you very much, Reka. We have some incoming questions. I'm going to begin with this second one, which I believe is more related to this argument that you're building. So it's, how do you deal with malicious informants? Do you have a method to identify them, an expert system or a machine learning technique? That's the first question. And the second is more related to the specific kind of research that you showed us today. Did you try to compare the numbers of reports that you managed to collect through web scraping versus police administrative data, public services data? And if you did so, how comparable it was, bearing in mind that you collected data on crimes, but also on other urban problems?
Yeah. So I'm gonna start with the second one because I feel like I've already forgotten the first one because I got excited about the second one. So with the second one, yeah, with the Fix My Street data, what I did as part of this was part of my thesis actually back in the day. So I used Camden as a case study. I got the Fix My Street report. I also got from the council all of the complaint reports. So complaints made not only on Fix My Street, but also through calls and through emails. And I think that's the only two avenues. So complaint data, compared that with Camden Council, they do this kind of environmental audit where they hire people to go and just monitor the streets. So they go out and they note levels of litter in an area or levels of graffiti in an area. So they will drive around and do that. And then we also had a survey that was carried out in the area, which asked people the question, in general, how much of a problem do you think is, and then these problems, so rubbish lying around, for example. And we found that there was a relationship, so between the survey of how much of a problem do you think is rubbish lying around, and the audit, so the officials going around and like, this is graffiti, this is litter, there was like pretty much no correlation. They were in very different places. They did not agree. And the Fix My Street, or the complaints, they kind of sat in the middle. So they had a little bit in common with the notes, because obviously they are a specific thing that somebody is reporting rather than a general feeling. But they also had a little bit in common with I think this is a problem in my area. So that was quite interesting, because it does seem like it's this fusion of, there is a graffiti here and I think it's a problem. Whereas just counting the number of graffitis and asking people generally how big of a problem it is, those two things didn't seem to speak to each other so much. So that was interesting. I didn't compare to levels of crime because I wasn't asking about crime. So that's why I compared to levels of the graffiti and litter. But that might be an interesting next step. And can you just remind me what the first question was again?
Yes, it was about how do you deal with malicious informants? Do you have a method to identify them, an expert system or a machine learning technique?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And that is an open area of research. So far, what I've been sort of banking on is that we have large enough numbers so that if somebody is just trying to report an area as, you know, this is a problem because I don't like it, rather than because something is actually happening there, hopefully that'll, you know, turn into a noise with enough methods. But it could be quite interesting to see how malicious, so something like training some sort of I don't know, neural net to, you know, process the language and be able to identify, like, this doesn't sound like a genuine report, might be a very interesting approach. I know this has been done looking at reviews on TripAdvisor. But so some people can pay, so I could pay, please review my favorite brewery in Manchester and tell everyone how amazing it is, and I will pay you, I don't know, in beer for doing this. But I think what that particular study did is they asked people on Mechanical Turk, which is this it's also a piece of crowdsourcing. It's where you can hire lots of, I guess, research assistants in the distance to write reviews. And trained an algorithm to compare the Mechanical Turk reviews to what they found on TripAdvisor. And there's a couple of issues on there around, again, the representative of the sample of what you're training that on. But that might be a good paper. I can try and dig it out. That might be a good paper to start thinking about these sorts of things, because that is an open problem, and it would be good to know how we can identify malicious reports. I mean, I had lots of fun reading the Fix My Street reports, going through, especially for the frequent reporters, where they write very dramatic, long prose about the tree that has fallen over and it's ruining their lives, or somebody left the sofa on the driveway and that's ruining their lives. So those aren't quite malicious, but it'd be interesting to weed out seriousness as well. There's lots of scope of using those kinds of techniques.
Thank you, Reka. If it's okay, David might join us to respond the pending question on how to deal with.
Sorry, I put you on the spot.
It's okay. Go ahead, David, please.
I think you're muted.
We can hear you, David. I don't know if it's your mic or.
Yeah, I think you might be muted. No.
No.
This question just doesn't want to be answered. You're gonna have to read our paper.
I hope that paper is cited in your presentation.
I think so, yeah. It'll be, yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Mitigating bias with small area estimation.
Great. Okay, well, we'll have to read the paper then. Another question is, how can those data sources and methods help to generate insights about different transportation modes? And how can we take into account structural and institutional differences between different places, especially in terms of global south, global north? So
transport is really close to my heart as a topic. So I thank you for that question. I implemented, so the data collection one, the Fear of Crime reporting app. I started working with Transport for London on that to try and measure people's experiences along a particular bus route. So there's this bus route that goes through London. It's very long and it's 24 hours, and it was known as a high problem bus route. But obviously not all of it. It goes through some very nice areas and then some non-nice areas, and then, you know, at different times and so on. So what TfL wanted to know is where and when are the problem areas, so that they can look at what kind of design interventions or policing interventions they might be able to deploy to make people feel safer, to reduce crime, and so on. And so what we did is we applied the same experience sampling mobile app, but instead of asking people 4 times a day how they felt, it was triggered by a geofence. So if they neared any of the bus stops that were on this line, they would get a ping, you know, how are you feeling, or a little reminder, please tell me how safe you feel, and so on. And on the bus, they could do this as well. Now, this introduces lots of fun technical problems. For example, how do you know if the person is walking to the bus stop, waiting at the bus stop, if they're on the bus, because you just get a point. right? So then there's different ways of being able to tell, maybe if you sample their location and they're going at the speed of a bus, you might infer, okay, they're inside the bus. But if the bus is stuck in traffic and the bus is going very slowly, it might erroneously infer walking, this sort of thing. But there's precedent of trying to infer these sorts of things. And originally, this was thought about as a way of addressing worry on transport, because the idea of that Transport for London at the time we're saying is we want to take this whole journey approach. So we want to know from the moment you leave your house to the moment you get to your destination, so including walking to the bus stop, waiting, getting on the bus, taking the bus, walking back, and so on. At each stage, what is going on? How are people feeling? Were they experience any victimization? This sort of thing. So those, I think those methods can apply to transport setting. Now, in terms of Global South, I don't have a lot of experience with research in Global South, so that would be very interesting. But one thing I would say is when people are reporting something that makes them feel worried, alive, the biggest ethical concern, and one that I did implement in my app, was that you have to give them a space to go to a safe place first. So if I'm on the bus and I think somebody behind me is going to steal my phone, then you probably don't want me like, ding, ding, okay, let me fill out the survey, right? Because that's gonna make me lose my phone. And so that was something that I thought about and implemented in the original version of the app, is a way for people to have retrospective reporting option, so they can, once they are in a safe place, be presented with a map, and then on the map choose where they experience something, and then report it. Because that you don't want to put people in any more of a situation of victimization, like opportunity, than they already are through the research design. But yeah, I mean, anywhere with transport, if anybody wants to roll this out on any sort of transport mode, I would definitely be very happy to talk, because that is my pet area of interest.
Thank you. What do you think of having a team or network of volunteers for the validation of reports? Or do you recommend an automatic report validation method?
So, I mean, from my understanding of these kinds of automated validation methods, they would have to be trained on something. So it would probably be a fusion of these. Yeah, I haven't done a lot of research in the specific area of the validation, but it makes sense to define the parameters based on interpretation first of what is a genuine report and what isn't, because these are difficult and fuzzy boundaries. I know there's been work, for example, identifying hateful speech on Twitter, and all of the work in that area I know starts with defining, okay, what is hateful speech? And that's a non-trivial problem, right? What will we flag as this is not acceptable, this is acceptable? And then being able to codify that in a systematic way to then, or get enough of them, I guess, to, if you're having teaching something that's unsupervised, to teach it and evaluate, definitely requires human input, at least in the beginning. I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that, because you're trading off that kind of insight and accuracy of human coders, especially if you have multiple and you can get some intercoder reliability and you have reliable coding, versus scaling this up so that it can work on the hundreds and thousands of reports that you might be interested to collect. So my answer is both.
Okay, and we have one last question. It says, ethic issues vary from region to region, country to country, and the assumptions while selecting the model for our research should consider all these discrepancies. What do you recommend as a guideline to a researcher who may be facing such a problem while conducting the research and presenting the results in such a multicultural situation?
So just so I understand the question, that means that the ethics vary from certain situation So what is acceptable in one situation, maybe less so in the other. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. What would you recommend for the researcher to take into account while conducting the research in this kind of discrepancy situations?
I think ethics is an interesting area that is getting a lot more attention in sort of data and tech spheres, and I think that's a good thing. But in terms of what constitutes an ethical issue, which might be a problem for one context and not another one, I'm not sure I've encountered this kind of problem myself. I would probably err on the side of caution and maybe find the lowest common denominator and safeguard everyone. Because ethics it's really about, I mean, in the case of these specific data sets, so where's my, if I go back, almost all of these really come down to safeguarding the people who you are studying or who might be your participants, or who might be volunteering your information. And so if, okay, data ownership, that might be a technical one, but the other ones around the privacy and surveillance and not sort of identifying people who are maybe reporting what is it might be sensitive topic if we're talking about crime and victimization or even fear of crime, I think is a duty as a researcher that we owe to the groups that we are studying. So as long as those are safeguarded, yeah, I would maybe go for the most safeguarding over the least. And I mean, in terms of implications for service slanting, that has lots of relevance for policy and practice. So understanding who it is that is represented in the data and how that influences the decisions that we make and who might be benefiting from those and who might be excluded from those is important. There's lots of good literature around the sort of bias in data and tech that's been going around mostly on well, I've seen going around on Twitter because that's where I'm spending my time. So there's lots of good reading around that. So I'm happy to take this offline and recommend some things. It's not my area of research, but it's something that I think we should engage with if we're using these kinds of data and making decisions based on them.
Okay, here's a more technical question, and someone who also read your papers. Can you tell us about how did you feature extraction when analyzing the tweets related to missing persons? Did you make use of any statistical neural language processing machine or deep learning methods?
So not really is the answer. I wanted to, and not hugely. What I'm trying to remember. So there's I think most exciting in this sense thing that I did with the feature extraction was the sentiment analysis. So I did make use of some of the sentiment libraries that exist out there. If I recall, we went with AFIN in the end to kind of score the sentiment of the tweet. And I thought, this was brilliant. We're gonna get if there's a dark and gloomy tweet, then it's not going to be retweeted. But if it's hopeful and positive, then it will be. But it had, and I am not a machine learning background person, so I'm sure there might be ways of getting around it. But for this specific purpose, it had a lot of trouble because a lot of these tweets were short and descriptive, but maybe not so emotive, or maybe didn't contain as many emotive words as might be needed. So for example, if somebody went missing and they had dark hair, dark is a negative sentiment word. So by function of having dark hair, all of a sudden that score dropped in this case. But there must be better approaches for being able to extract more meaningful information. So you could do things like with the hate crime and tweets example, where they actually classify, so you can build classifiers and then say, this is something like this. You could possibly use some topic modeling, although I don't know if tweets are long enough do that, but there's probably versions of topic modeling that work well on short text, again, to do some sort of classification, and then use that. But in this case, what the outcome of the Twitter paper is to build recommendations. So to say, if you say, please retweet, you will get more retweets. So when you ask for appeal for missing person, include the phrase, please retweet. Whereas I think with a lot of the sort of unsupervised learning approaches, you get good accuracy, but not a lot of transparency. And so it's hard to make these kinds of recommendations. So make your tweets more like this group and less like this group might be harder to action. But I don't know. And that might be, again, an interesting question to answer. But most of it was done by coding, good old-fashioned thematic analysis.
Okay. Well, I believe it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much, Reka, for this wonderful talk on new forms of data for public safety. I believe this kind of platforms and spaces are really helpful, especially for countries that are facing, just like in Mexico, a huge security crisis. And we need to innovate the kinds of methods that we're using to build or construct our statistics and conduct our research. Thank you so much, Reka, University of Manchester, and Ricardo, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much for having me and for sharing and the good questions.
Well, thank you very much to you all, and this was very, very interesting, and we hope we can find some more ways to organize some more things together and learn from you. Thank you, Reka. Thank you also, David, also there, Juanjo, if you're there also, and thank you everyone for participating. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.